Hello guys, good day to everyone. We are the group 2 and we are assigned to report chapter 5, a critical survey of the different normative ethical theories commonly used in business decision making. For my part, I will discuss to you the first and second normative ethical theories. From the word normative, the root word is a principle of right action binding upon the members of a group and serving to guide, control, or regulate proper and acceptable behavior. Ethics is not only concerned with the study of what is right or wrong in our human conduct. As a practical science, ethics also investigates how man ought to behave in a very specific and concrete situation by examining his conduct in the light of various norms that guide his moral judgments. So, mo lagi itong kanang whenever mag-decide ta, nadyo tay kanang i-base sa atong dapat i-act para makuha na tong dapat jud nga buhaton sa pag-decide. The word ought also implies the moral obligation on the part of actor or the doer of such action. So the first normative ethical theories is the norms of morality according to the scholastic philosophy and traditional ethics. As you can see, this is the evaluating the human conduct. Morning mag-decide sa pag-decide nato sa mga business decision making. Human conduct may kuanta sa norms, ethical principles, rules, among others. Then, with along sa conformity or non-conformity. Conformity means it's an action in accordance with some specified standard or authority. And then, inigkuman na ito kuan sa atong action o mubay sa mga norms, mapata mo kuan sa judgment. Sa judgment na ay moral or immoral. As we have known, moral relating to principles of right and wrong and behavior. Next is the norms of morality. Conscience. Conscience means a faculty, power, or principle enjoining good acts. It is the approximate norm of morality. Practical judgment of reason deciding upon an individual act as good and to be followed or as evil, and therefore to be avoided. There are 8 types of conscience, namely antecedent, consequent, true or false, erroneous, certain, doubtful, scrupulous, and lax. Next is types of conscience. Number 1, antecedent conscience. It is the judgment before an action is done. From the word antecedent, it is a preceding event or coming event. Number 2, consequent conscience, judgment after an act is done. Mo conscience nga mo follow pa sa result. And then true conscience, it is a conscience which judges things truly as they are. Mo judge ta nga mauna jud na nga dapat buhaton. Erroneous conscience judges things in a distorted manner since it considers bad act as good and good act as bad. Number 5, certain conscience is a subjective certainty of the legality of particular action to be done or to be omitted. Kanang sure na ka nga kana jud imong buhaton nga sakto jud na. And ingon ng mga philosopher nga kailangan mo jud ni usa sa mga dapat sundon ang certain conscience. Number 6, doubtful conscience happens when a person is not certain about moral judgment. Muning conscience nga magduha-duha ta sa pag-decide. 7. Scrupulous conscience, one which sees wrong where there is none. Muning conscience mo na mahadlok ta nga mahitabo. So, kuan po niya, firm po ni nga conscience. Firm ni nga pag kuanin mo sa imong decision nga. Mo na jud na. Number 8, lax conscience. It is opposite of scrupulous conscience. It is fails to see wrong where there is wrong. Magbabuta-buta. Then, it has natural law and external law. Eternal law. Natural law here is that ageris succitor esse, or action follows being. It is a remote norm of morality. It reflects what the thing is accordance to its nature. For example is that the scorpion of the old man. Ang nature sa scorpion is mupaak, o ang nature sa human is mutabang. So, ang mo-reflect sila sa ilang buhat based on its nature. Eternal law, ngayon ko na sila nga, ang natural law is derived sa divine law. The eternal law is ultimate norm of morality. It is the plan of God in creating the universe and assigning to its creature a specific nature. Business applications. Ideally, the three norms of morality katong the conscience, eternal law, and natural law o eternal law, according to traditional ethics, must be able to guide our business decision-making process. However, these three criteria is not widely accepted by decision makers. Common sense directs that the dictates of reason should be enough to guide our evaluation between the action that we perform and the norms that we determine what is acceptable and what is not in our behavior, human behavior. Common sense jud ng ang atong buhaton jud kada jung maadyo. Ja likayan tong dautan. So we go for the second normative ethical theories, the Kantian ethics, founded by Immanuel Kant. Here's we have moral rationalism. Kant believed that reason is autonomous. For him, it is the be-all and end-all of everything. He also believed that truth and knowledge, laws and moral principles are derived from reason. According to Kant, reason commands and we must obey it without questioning. For Kant's morality, it is a priori, not based on experience, universal, applied sa tanan, absolute, complete, and fixed ang moral laws. Immutable, cannot be changed ang moral laws. Why must we do good? We do good. Kant's answer that we must do good because we must. It is our duty to obey immediately without questioning. Duty is the test and the mainspring of all morally good acts. That's why duty is the motive in moral acts. Anyway. Sunod is Kant's categorical imperative. Categorical imperative is a moral obligation or command that is unconditionally and universally binding. Sa Kant, moral duties can be derived from the categorical imperative, which can be formulated in three ways. The first formulation is the formula of universal law or the principle of universalizability. It says that act only in accordance with that maxim, through which you can at the same time will that it becomes a universal law. The second formulation is the formula of humanity or the principle of humanity. It says that act only in accordance with that with the act that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as end, never merely as means. The third formulation is the formula of autonomy. It is a synthesis of the previous two formulation. Muning katong the formula of universal law o the formula of humanity. It says that we should so act that we may think of ourselves as legislating universal laws through our maxims, which may think of ourselves as such autonomous legislators only insofar as we follow our own law. Next is critique on Kant's ethical philosophy. Here we have his theory does not explain why reason commands and why we must obey. Kant only said that reason is a declarative faculty. It sees things, it does not make things. It tells the law, but it does not make the law. His theory does not explain why reason commands. And second, Kant misses to reflect that human reason does not and cannot make the moral law. Dire, man only discovers the moral law in its very nature, as because we are rational animal. Therefore, Kant is wrong because reason does not make the moral law. It only tells us about the law. Another theory is that duty cannot be the only motive in the performance of an act because there are other motives that are more worthy. The example is the death of Rizal and Nina Aquino are example of action whose motivations are not inspired by one's senses of duty but by love of country. According to Kant, actions of Rizal and Aquino cannot be considered morally good because they were not done out of pure sense of duty. Lastly is the business applications. First, we have Kant introduces the importance of humanistic dimensions into business decisions. For example, one is that treat human beings not as means to an end, because human beings have ends in themselves. B. Kant stresses the importance of motives and of acting on principles. For example, its business decisions are based sometimes on personal convictions sa ato and principle regardless of the outcomes of results. Lastly, the Kant's categorical imperative gives us firm rules to follow in moral decision making, rules that do not depend on circumstances or results, and that do not permit individual exceptions. For example is that no matter what the consequences may be or who does it, some actions are always wrong. Like lying, breaking promises, and others.
Hello everyone, my name is Renz Lacerna and I'm here to talk about the third and fourth normative ethical theories that is commonly used in business decision making. Now, let's talk about the third normative ethical theory. It is called the Machiavellian Principle by Niccolo Machiavelli. Ug karon atong ilailahod kinsang ni si Uncle Niccolo. Born on 1469, Machiavelli was an Italian Renaissance diplomat, philosopher, and writer, best known for his book, The Prince, written in 1513. He has often been called the father of modern political philosophy and political science. He was sent to France to be part of Second Chancery of Florence, and later on sent to Imola with Caesar Borgia, Duke of Romagna, region in northern Italy. In the year 1512, he lost his post at the Chancery and returned to Florence. In the year 1513, he was suspected of taking part in an abortive conspiracy and was tortured, imprisoned, and fined heavily until Cardinal Giovanni Medici was elected Pope and became Pope Leo X. At that time, Machiavelli was in the government, but few years later, the Medici government collapsed. He lost his position in the government, and the collapse of the government was the reason why he came up with his philosophy. Okay, now let's talk about the Machiavellian principle. This principle is all about the relative power of good and evil forces in society, and the rules and principle of effective political behavior. So technically, it talks about the ways on how to govern and to become a leader in a country or organization. Machiavelli wrote his unsystematic thoughts in two books, The Prince and the Discourses. The book, The Discourses, had a positive feedback about the government, about enthusiasm for self-government and liberty. On the other hand, the book, The Prince, his emphasis was on the need for an absolute monarch, where the leader should do whatever it takes for the good of his state. Also, in the book, The Prince describes his concept of a leader as cruel, evil, and deceiving person. Machiavellian principle suggests that sometimes people have to do something not necessarily good to attain something good. Indicates that a leader should be prepared to do evil when necessary to gain or maintain power. His principles were based on personal experiences. So he worked for the government and observed how weak the state of Florence was, and that he thought that it was all because of the weaknesses of the leaders, and eventually led to the collapse of the state. His principles only wanted to have a strong leader, to have a strong state, a strong leader to unite Italy at that time. His principles suggest that how a leader should govern effectively. In Machiavellian principle, there is a famous quote, "The end justifies the means," interpreted as whatever the action, the act, if the result is good, then it is good. Results weigh more than the act. Machiavelli believed that whatever the leader would do, anything just to gain and maintain power and for his state, is neither immoral or illegal. He clearly promotes the concept of violence in his ethical philosophy. The end justifies the means. Here are some examples of this principle when applied or practiced. On government. During Arroyo's time, Philippines experienced financial crisis and our economy may collapse. Applying the end justifies the means, the government implemented 12% VAT to collect more taxes from people and therefore have more funds to spare various projects for the poor. So, gipasa ang 12% VAT kuno sa kadtong Arroyo nga panahon kaya makatabang sa economy o garunay extra funds para makatabang sa mga pobre. Mao na ang means, mao na ang purpose, mao na ang rason nga gi-apply to. However, this decision didn't turn out well as higher tax would mean higher cost of commodities that the public has to shoulder, and there will be indirect payment of tax. So, ang nahitabo, imbis makatabang sa mga pobre, ning samot na hinog kalisod, tungod ang mga palitonon ning mahal, tungod kay ang mga negosyante gipatong nila ang tax ngadto sa ilang mga produkto o ang mga consumer rapod ang mubayad. The poor becomes poorer and the rich becomes richer. But the law made the economy recover. So ang end ingani is that the economy recovered from the near collapse tungod sa financial crisis. So the end justifies the means. So naman naka-recover man ang economy from near collapse. So bisan pag nagkalisod kuno ang mga tao nagkapobre tungod kay dako na ang tax, baliwala ra kuno basta ang resulta ang importante nga naka-recover ang economy. So mo to ang giingon ni Uncle Nicolo nga a leader should do anything just to gain or maintain power. Bahalag magkinaunsa pa na ang gi-decide okay it is neither immoral or illegal if the end is to maintain or to gain power. Another example on this principle is on business application. Example is on the management. Management styles where all employees are required to work very hard no matter what it takes just to achieve the bottom line. The end justifies the means. Employees sacrifice their time for family, socials, and God just to comply with their work demands. The company only wanted good results, the end, and doesn't care about how they come up with the results, the means. So, para sa kumpanya, bahala kung magkapuliki ng ilang mga empleyado, basta ang ilang work demands o ang ilang goal sa company is ma-achieve, then it is good. Bahala magka stress pa ng mga employee dira. Now let's talk about the fourth normative ethical theory that is commonly used in business decision making. It is called utilitarianism by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. So again, atong ilailahon ning atong mga angkol, ang mga author ng utilitarianism principle. First, Jeremy Bentham. Born 1748 to a wealthy Tory family in London, at the age of 3, he has read the multi-volume history of England, studied the Latin grammar at age 4, received Bachelor of Arts degree at the Queen's College in Oxford 3 years after his entrance at the age of 12, obtained Master of Arts degree from same school, studied as lawyer but never practiced law, and then decided to go into a literary career, published his first book entitled Fragment on Government in 1776. That is all about critique on the political views of his law teacher. He wanted to create law not just for the convenience of the elite, but also for the best interest of the whole community. He became enemy to church authorities, lawyers, members of parliament, and wealthy businessmen, but popular to many English citizens because of his thinking. Now, let's talk about John Stuart Mill. Born 1806, son of a well-known philosopher James Mill, who admired Jeremy Bentham. His father made him read Greek at the age of 3 and Latin at the age of 8. He is known to have read Plato's Dialogue at the age of 10, received intense schooling from his father every day. Now let's talk about the utilitarianism theory by Jeremy Bentham. Utilitarianism comes from the word utili bonum or utilis, which means usefulness. It is considered the most important consequentialist theory, which believes that do whatever produces the greatest good for the greatest number. An action is considered good if it gives the person the greatest pleasure or happiness. This theory believes that what makes an act right is its consequences and not the motive of the action, similar to hedonism. Utilitarianism theory believes that the effect or consequences determine the goodness or badness of an action. An act is good if it results in good consequences. Otherwise, it is immoral. So basically, utilitarianism theory puts significance on the consequences as a result of an act and completely disregards the motive of an act. So, bahala na nang yun sa imong mga rason, kung unsay resulta, mauna, maadyo ang resulta, maadyo, lain ang resulta, di maadyo. Simple. It is the same as the Machiavellian principle. The results must weigh more than the motive. Utilitarian principle disregards the importance of motive because motive is known only to the person who has it. For example, if a man builds a bridge so people can cross to avoid the flood, the action is said to be praiseworthy. Good motive and good consequence is considered good act. But if a man collects money to whoever crosses the bridge, the act may be selfish, but the action would be praiseworthy. No, I mean, the motive may be selfish, but the action would be praiseworthy. Bad motive, but good consequence, which is for the people to avoid the flood, is considered a good act in utilitarian theory. Only the consequences matters. Now, let's talk about the utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill believes that human beings pursue happiness and will avoid pain or suffering. He also believed that an act that promotes happiness is moral and that act which causes pain is immoral. To utilitarian, happiness is not merely the happiness of one person, but rather the happiness of greater number of people. The more the merrier. There are two definitions of happiness by John Stuart Mill. Positive definition and not so positive definition. First is that happiness is anything that is pleasurable to the greater number of people. And the other definition states that happiness is the absence of pain. The concepts of pleasure and pain are central to the utilitarian theory. What is pleasurable is good, and what is painful is bad. What causes pleasure is good, and what causes pain is immoral. According to Mill, pleasure has two factors: the physical pleasure and the mental pleasure. Physical pleasure indulges to bodily gratification like sexual intercourse, eating, drinking, and many more. Mental pleasure is all about intellectual, spiritual, and moral pleasure, like man's noble feelings, imagination, and moral sentiments. Physical pleasure is the lower form of pleasure and considered as animalistic or beastly, since it appeals to the lower faculties of man. On the other hand, mental pleasure is superior and is generally more difficult to achieve, and pursuing them gives dignity to man, like freedom of will, intellect, social recognition, feeling of self-worth, and respect. So Mill's utilitarianism refers to mental pleasure when it defines happiness as pleasure. So ingon si Uncle Mill, nga og naghatag na nimo og kalipay, then it is good. If naghatag na nimo og kasakit, then it is immoral. So applying this utilitarian theory on business application, it can be used in cost-benefit analysis. So projects are determined by their outcome and not by process. So if the results are good, then sagdi na lang mga cost-benefit, that mas importante ang benefit kaysa cost. Second is formulation of budgets, determining the budget if it has good results. And the third is guide in decision making, labor management, that dapat win-win for both labor and management nga way malkansi sa duha. So dapat result is always good to satisfy this principle. And that concludes my report. Thank you for listening, and I'm out.
Now, let's move on to our next topic, which is Moral Positivism by Thomas Hobbes, year 1588 to 1679. Hobbes was born in Malmesbury, Wiltshire, England on April 5, 1588. He finished his college degree in Oxford University in England. Now, what do you think pushes Thomas Hobbes in believing moral positivism? Because Thomas worked as an advisor, he traveled a lot, and upon his traveling, he met leading European intellectuals that studied different forms of government. Since then, he became interested in reasons why people allow themselves to be ruled by others. He even wrote a book called or entitled Leviathan, where the content of the book states that people are naturally wicked and could not be trusted to govern. Ethical philosophy of moral positivism. Thomas believes that human beings are basically selfish creatures who would do anything to improve their possession. Therefore, they should not be trusted to make their own decision because it is selfishly motivated. He also believed that every country is a constant battle of war and power. Law of the state is considered to be the basis of all moral laws, which means it is considered good if it is in accordance to the law and evil when it is prohibited by the law. Well, I have this quote coming from the book stating that man is a wolf unto his fellow man, which means that a man can attack whomever he wants unknowingly, but because of the law, he cannot do it. Simply means that the law becomes the cage or the central authority nga nung dili mabuhat sa man. So, simply means that the authority is the reason to avoid evil and discord in a society. Therefore, governments are created to protect their people from their own selfishness and evil. He also believed that democracy, or allowing people to vote for the government, is not effective. Simply means because all of us are self-interested. and that selfishness will end after we will die. Critics on moral positivism. Solely dependent on the laws established by the state. Moral positivism sets aside the natural order of the things. So because moral positivism is solely independent on the laws established by the state, the one who created the law has the sole responsibility of what is right or wrong, where in fact, there is a natural law pa before ana. So, because ingana, naset aside na gibalang essence sa natural law na to. Example, killing human beings. Naturally, it is an evil act, but in moral positivism, it can be good if it is legalized by the law. So, those are some examples or critics on moral positivism. Now, let's move on to the significance of moral positivism. Moral positivism anticipates the chaotic outcome if laws are not abided, which is true because the only purpose sa gajod, or most of the purpose sa law, is to protect the rights of the people, preserve the justice in which society should have in order to attain peace. Business application of moral positivism. Businesses must follow the laws of the state and government regulations. Business enterprise must create company policies to maintain discipline and order within the organization. Businessmen and managers should be law-abiding citizens. And lastly, strong authority figures are sometimes necessary in organizations to dissuade people from doing evil and to prevent discord. Next is the divine command ethics. This chair believes that there is a divine being who has set down a finite series of rules that adherent claim can provide guidance to most, if not all, moral decisions. Most likely is sa religion dyan ni siya that we believe that there is a divine being who is all-knowing and that no one can be compared to his wisdom. So for us, we have the Holy Trinity, God. Muslims, they have Allah. Next is the analysis of the divine mandate theory. First, not all people believe that God exists. Second, it cannot cover all possible cases of moral decision. Third, there is no exception. And lastly is this euthypro problem, which means that if it says so, does it really mean that it is morally good and acceptable, or it is immorally unacceptable? Then, one could question assenting rules provided by the command theory. Divine command responses to analysis. For true believer, it is simply a matter of seeing the light. Enough study and faith could come to generally acceptable interpretations, which is true for us, that who believes that there is really a divine being. We believe that that divine being has superior wisdom that had answers if we are unable to justify something due to our limitations as human. However, while divine command ethics seems suitable for personal decision-making, it appears somewhat problematic when one is required to reason together with those of a different belief. Now, let's move on to my last topic, which is ethical egoism by Ayn Rand, 1905 to 1982. Rand was born in St. Petersburg, Russia in February 2, 1905. She is a novelist and philosopher. And ethical egoism, it solely focuses that morality is all about self-interest, that existence exists in a single choice, to live. And in living, we have three values of life: reason, purpose, and self-esteem. Reason as a tool of knowledge, purpose as a choice of happiness, and self-esteem as worthy of living. Rational selfishness. Moral purpose of one's life is the achievement of his own happiness. Sacrifice is a form of evil, and self-deprivation is also evil. Like say for example, there is a drowning man. If that drowning man is a stranger, according to our rational selfishness, you would not care to save his life because you would risk yours. But if that drowning man is your loved one, you will save them not because you care and love for them, but because you are afraid that without that person, your life becomes miserable and unbearable and that you will become so sad. So in ethical egoism, ang i-amplify diri is that humans are primarily self-interested. That before we think of others, we tend to think about our self-interest first. That even though we are willing to die for others, that does not mean na we care and love for them, but because we care for ourselves too much. Critic on objectivism. Objectivism includes possessions which are at odds with the ideas held by most people. Objectivism is a guide to win life and not a philosophy in winning games. It attempts to provide an explanation of humanity without adequate reference to the reality of being a member of the species of humanity. It attempts in trying to place philosophy above science to place the man above reality. Egotist versus egoist. Egotist is a person who has a very high opinion of himself, and whose language often consists of self-praise, while egoist is a person who thinks in terms of his own advantage, generally by disregarding the interest of others. So, ang kalahian na gajud nganing egotist and egoist is that ang egotist is he loves himself so much, iyang self-praise, ingana, she's arrogant sa iyang kaugalingon. While ang egoist is that self-interested ra gajud siya, naunahon niya ang iyang kaugalingon before others. Business application. In business decision making, sometimes self-interest is considered and given priority over the interest of others. The decision making must be done rationally. The promotion of self-interest, especially on the parts of the employees, are sometimes preferred than the interests of the organization. And lastly, self-esteem and confidence are important personality factors of business leaders and managers. So in conclusion sa hang report, there is a common denominator ra gajud nila, that whatever we believe or our principles, there will always be some critics about it. And it does, and every aspect could contribute either good or bad impression.
Hello everyone, I'll be continuing chapter 5. I will be in charge of number 8, virtue ethics, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So virtue ethics focuses on the character of the person and the virtue that he manifests. So a person must reflect the appropriate moral virtue and integrity in making decisions rather than focusing on reasons for doing the action. So in virtue ethics, we focus more on the integrity and the virtue of the person that decides the decision making rather than the reasons for making the decisions him or herself. So the three main proponents of virtue ethics is Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So Socrates has three special tenets in his moral philosophy. So that is the number 1, virtue, which is knowledge; vice, the lack of knowledge or ignorance; and number 3, no one commits an evil act knowingly; doing wrong arises out of ignorance. So in Socrates' philosophy, we are all good, but the lack of knowledge or ignorance, as we may say, causes us as a person to commit evil acts unknowingly and makes us do bad things or something that is not good. So in business application, in the business world, employers make critical decisions that have impacts on the operation of the company, which results might lead to uncertainty. So as a person in charge of business decision making, or as you might say, a manager, then as a manager, we are responsible for the virtue and the integrity that we manifest through the company. So if we continue to gain the knowledge and do things that are good, then our company will be more credible and reputable as a whole. We will attract more business opportunities to our company, because good attracts good, as they may say. So to have a good and reputable company is part of the business decision making as a manager. So the next is Plato. So Plato's ethical philosophy is knowing the forms. People are born to be intrinsically good, however they make judgment through the irrational part of the soul, thus results to a moral conflict. So Plato was a student of Socrates. That's how he may have gotten that all persons are good. but make wrong decisions or bad decisions due to ignorance. So Plato in business application is in business decision making an outcome is acceptable only if it is done in the light of reasonable process according to Plato's concept of a virtuous act. So in making decisions we must reason out the reasons for trying to do that decision in decision making, because if we ask ourselves too many times the same question, then we would also question why we would do that act, and this would in turn make better decisions for the company and for the better good of the business. So next in his business application is Plato believes that a reasonable and virtuous action is one that is not dominated by the will or the appetite. So by the will or by the appetite, so in Plato's philosophy we must create decisions as just for the business, and we do not take part in it with our subconscious mind, such as how we will be compensated for making that decisions or something like that, because that would be allowing our appetite or our will to dominate that reason in decision making. So we must separate our will and our appetite from that decision in order to make that decision to be a virtuous act. So next is Aristotle. So Aristotle's ethical philosophy is, according to Aristotle, we must take the middle way or the mean between two extremes. So virtue comes from the ability to govern excessive or lack of feelings. Any extremes would lead to vice, thus virtue comes from the mean between these extremes. So Aristotle is also a student of Plato. So Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. So Aristotle's philosophy differs from them because there is like the golden mean, which is vice, virtue, and vice. So if we take our feelings on one extremes, then it would be vice, and if we lack too much of it, then it would also be vice. So to be in the middle is the virtue that we should aim for. So in business application, in production and planning and inventory control, finished goods and raw materials may be carefully controlled to lower costs. So in inventory control, in business decision making, we must plan out carefully on how much we create products or how much we take in raw materials, because having too much of raw materials would be a high opportunity loss, which means that we will not be able to satisfy the demand, and having too much of the raw materials or the finished goods would also cause us high inventory cost or high inventory cost, which would also cost us more money and less profit. So the second is the principle of moderation can also be used in determining and planning for profit in business. So that's the same as number one. We must plan between the two extremes to be in the middle, because in the middle will where we should attain what is the goal of the Aristotle's philosophy. So see, virtuous conduct is important not just in decision making but also in maintaining moral ascendancy and personal integrity. So in decision making, we should always consider the golden mean between the two extremes. So we must also balance our decision making with our ascendancy and personal integrity to make the company more reputable. And this success in business is not only measured in profit but also the company's moral integrity and credibility. So that is the same as C, which are success is not about just creating money, but it is also about how we keep our company's integrity and virtue as we proceed to make the company or the business grow as a whole. Continuing chapter 5, number 9, the concepts of good and evil, Epicureanist and hedonist philosophies. So hedonist philosophies. Hedonism, hedon or sensuous pleasure, and contends that happiness is the goal of our human life that must be searched for and pain must be avoided. So hedonists maintain that the most moral virtues are to be learned and pursued. For them, pleasure is natural and has a very strong inclination that we do not have command ourselves by moral right. So in hedonist philosophy, our goal of the human life in their philosophy is that we should attain pleasure, and we must always avoid pain if we can, and that pleasure will always be our moral right, and that it will always have a strong inclination in what we do in decision making. So next is Epicureanism, the doctrine of pleasure. So Epicurus, his philosophy deals with one's own very practical concerns, a way of living, not an abstract system of thought. Epicurus maintained that the life which contains the greatest amount of happiness and the least pain should be an every being human's goal. So in Epicureanism, this is more of a step up in hedonism, because in Epicureanism, this is more of a simple common sense in his part, because in his kind of philosophy, we must also attain happiness in our human life by obtaining pleasure, but we should also avoid pain. But his philosophy is more on practical things, such as our way of living and how we should attain happiness in the simple things, and not at the most instant and most sensuous pleasures that we can attain. So Epicureanism and hedonism. To Epicurus, pleasure is what good is and the ultimate goal of a human life. So maximum pleasures are found in those which would endure and even makes us wiser, not in momentous intensity of sensuous pleasures. So the main difference in Epicureanism and hedonism is that in Epicureanism, what they define as happiness is something that makes us improve, or something that makes us wiser as a whole, and not in such material things such as instantaneous sensuous pleasures in life. And in hedonism asserts the person of pleasure, which is unfailingly associated with self-interest. So in Epicureanism is it has more reasons and more natural, and has much more common sense, as which to hedonism, which is almost along the lines of having self-interest in the reasons in decision making. So in business applications, the pleasure pain principle is sometimes used in business decision making. Example, measuring the profit, which could be considered as pleasure, and the pain is the loss. So in the pleasure pain principle, we can use this in decision makings to count our profits and to count our losses, and be able to create decisions that would make the profit higher than the losses that we could attain, and possibly quite make the losses very low as possible. So the second is the concept of pleasure can also be used as a benchmark with businessmen derive reasonable returns from business activities. So in this part is that we benchmark we benchmark what we want to achieve is what we consider to be pleasure, and we benchmark what is pain, or such as losses in our business, and so on. So bye.
Hello, I'm Arlene Cortina. I am going to discuss to you the last 3 ethical normative theories commonly used in business decision making. So the 10th ethical normative theories commonly used in business decision making is the pragmatism of Porras, James, and Dewey. When we say pragmatism, it is a philosophy that attempts to clarify our ideas and emphasize the practical usefulness of ideas and beliefs as the criteria for truth. It actually bridges the gap between empiricism and rationalism. Ang pragmatism nag-maintain sa ZAG assumptions, like to be valid, all theories must be put into practice, there must be a close connection between thinking and acting, and the ideas to be regarded as true must be useful. Lastly, for ideas to be significant, there must be a practical result. The main proponents of this study are Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. Now, let's have his philosophy. Peirce focused his philosophy on logic and science. For him, there must be connectivity between idea and action. He said that our ideas are clear and distinct only if we can translate them into a meaningful action. He also added that in the logical analysis of meanings, an idea that is useful in solving the difference between two propositions is significant. So for him, if an idea is not useful in solving the difference or solving a problem or bringing about a desirable result, then it does not have any significance at all. Now, let's have James' philosophy. The philosophy of James focused on the pragmatism of psychology and religion. For him, pragmatism is an inquiry into the practical meaning of events and issues. Actually, kaning yung pragmatism, modified version ni sa kang Pors, katong first nga philosophy. Unja, para ni Jack, ang pragmatism associates the idea of practicality with truth, and thus, an idea is only true if it does what you want it to do. Manay dyan pragmatism. So, karon din ito sa philosophy ni Dewey. Ang isang philosophy naka-base sa ethics and sociology. Yung gitawag niya diyang version as instrumentalism or experimentalism. Kay para niya, ang knowledge and practice is the instrument of doing good. So, kabali, ang theories, dapat, it must be put into action para maka-yield siya desirable and predictable consequences. Actually, kaning ijang philosophy, naka-base siya sa concept of evolution ni Darwin. And then, in addition, in the context of education, ingon siya nga, ang school should reflect society kay nothing is more important than in remaking the society. So, nakakonclude si Janga, man can achieve moral progress and create an ideal society through improvements in education. So, it is more on education. So, we have learned what is pragmatism all about as introduced by Charles Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. Now, let's have the business application. The first one is, business plans remains to be plans unless they are executed and implemented. It is understandable. The next one, pragmatism as a philosophy has been associated with anything goes approach in business. The third, pragmatism as a philosophy seems to imply that the right solution to any problem becomes the practical solution and therefore the moral solution. So, kung unsa magaling ang solution na feel ni mo sakto na mao na dyan ang solution na gamiton. And then lastly, in business decision making, the concept of cash value is always considered. Of course, our jud nga na dyan na kanunay ang cash value. That's for the 10th ethical normative philosophy. Now, let's proceed with the Christian ethics. I have a question. What distinguished Christian ethics from other ethics? Well, to answer that, it is the Christian belief that the moral law is given not by an interpreter, but by the lawgiver, Jesus Christ. So first, let's have the ethical teaching of Jesus Christ, which is ang ijang moral paradigm similar sa kang Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And ang ijang ethical teaching, why moral stratification, meaning it does not discriminate between the rich and the poor, the slave and the free man, or the powerful and the weak. That's why ang ijang teaching of Jesus Christ it shows more preference to the poor, the oppressed, an ethics of love. It demands honesty and authenticity. It teaches faith in God as a Father, an ethics of peace and reconciliation, and demands sacrifice and suffering. And we all know that. We are all aware of that. So, mga ethical teachings ni Jesus Christ. The next ethical teaching is kang St. Augustine, which is ang central point sa ijang moral paradigm is si God. And para po ni God, ang highest attribute is love. Since God created the world out of His love man, and one thing na iyang gihatag sa man is ang free will, which is the choice to do good and bad. And tungod kay na free will, sumapod na reason nga ni exist ang evil. And when we say evil, it is the absence of good. Kay magbuhat magkagdautan ni nga na. Para ni Augustine, man by nature is imperfect, but capable siya of attaining perfection in the condition that man should keep himself good. And to be good is to desire for God. And moadto kang God, dapat na i-love. So mo nang nakakonclude siya that God as love drove him to take love as the basis and central point of his ethics. The third ethical teaching is kang Saint Thomas Aquinas. Ang ijang Themistic ethics nakabase sa Aristotelian ethics. So kibali din mo ma-appreciate ang Themistic ethics kung wani mo gi-appreciate ang Aristotelian ethics kay nakabase man lagi ang ethics nga na. Aquinas added his kanang concept sa beatific version, which is a term for salvation in which man sees God face to face. For Thomas Aquinas, every human actions geared towards ends, and ang ends is human happiness gajud na. Accordingly, Aquinas' concept is nakabase sa natural law o eternal law. For Aquinas, God plans for all things and directs all things to their proper order, proper purpose, and proper ends. Para ni Aquinas, ang natural law same na sa eternal law. So, kibali, usara na sila nga law. And since ang eternal law of God rules all things in their order and purpose man, money and niya, so kibali, ang man in his rational nature cannot be exempted from the governance of eternal law. So, that's for the ethical teaching of Saint Thomas Aquinas. So, let's have the business application. Christian ethics should provide the ultimate standard when benchmarking business decision. Pero, dili ta ng businessman mo promote sa Christian virtues. Kaya naman dyan uban, di ba, nga mga salbahis, nga mga business person. The next is the principle of stewardship. I-remind nato nga ang business decision makers, dapat may bawa nila nga earth's resources are not constant. Dapat i-preserve nato si John. Responsible ta sa mga resources na gihatag ni God. Kay na may natural order of things as planned by God Himself. So, we are down at the last ethical teaching, which is the ethical teachings of Buddhism. Gikuan na si John ni Siddhartha Gautama, as you can see in the picture, mo na si si Gautama. So, kani nga religion is the second oldest religion in India, a religion of liberation, and it is an ethics to relieve all forms of human suffering. Ang kaning Buddhism na najay three jewels, which is Buddha, Sangha, and Dharma. Okay, so the ethical teachings ni Buddha is, para niya, ang human has three basic characteristics, which is the suffering, the impersonality, and the impermanence. Ang kaning three basic human characteristics nag-constitute ni siya sa the truth of human suffering, which is, to annihilate the suffering, for Buddha, iyang giteach ang the four noble truths, and the continuum of these noble truths is the eightfold path, which is to be tackled on the next slides. So, as you can see in the slides, mana si ang four noble truths kanang sa baba, which is the truth of suffering, the find cause of the suffering, and then solution for the suffering, and lastly, implement the right action. And then kana sa albus nga part is mana ang eightfold path, the right view, know the truth, right intention, free your mind of evil, and then right speech, like say nothing that hurt others, right action, work for the good of others, right livelihood, respect life, and right effort, like resist the evil, and then right concentration, practice meditation, and then lastly, right mindfulness, like control your thoughts. Ihawa na mga bad thoughts or negativities, makaya na. But there are critics on the Buddhism as a philosophy. First critic is not all sufferings are actually bad as reflected by the Buddhism philosophy. Kaya ang suffering in Jesus Christ, di ba siya bad, kay para for the sake of the people, but that could na. And then the next philosophy is ang concept of nirvana, which is somewhat contradictory. Kay example, that bliss is only attained through the elimination of suffering. Then ang last is ang demand sa eightfold path, dili dyan na dyan ma-achieve or attained by a lot of people. Kay dili man ta kita tanan makaresist of evil. Kay man by nature is sinful, but dyan siya. So, that's the critics of Buddhism. So, we are down on our last slide for this report, which is the business application. Night week kabuok, Buddhism as a philosophy can offer a novel mindset sa mga employees and managers within the organization. Second, self-discipline can also be applied to the person's relationship with others, being included in the entities of the environment. And then the last one is Buddhism as a philosophy enjoins people to develop their sense of wisdom. For according to Buddha, wherever there is morality, there is wisdom. And whenever there is wisdom, there is morality. So, mana sa diyang ethical teachings of Buddhism. So, that's for our report. Thank you for listening. I hope you understand. God bless. Stay safe. Bye!